All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by Fresh Energy, highlighting the COP24 Global Climate Negotiations. My name is Anna Johnson, and I'll be introducing today's speakers, and Kaylee Long will be on hand to moderate the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's webinar will provide an overview of what was accomplished at the 2-week United Nations Global Climate Summit that occurred from December 2nd to December 15th, and what it means for Minnesota. We've left time at the end for questions, so please feel free to ask them at any point during the presentation. To submit a question, open the chat box on the left side of your monitor, type it in, and hit submit. Questions are only sent to the moderators, so please feel free to ask freely. From December 2nd to the 15th, the world's nations gathered in Katowice, Poland to take part in the United Nations Climate Change Summit. These annual negotiations are part of the ongoing discussions around how the international community can avoid the worst effects of climate change. Today we'll be hearing from J. Drake Hamilton and Patrick Hamilton, who both recently returned from Poland and are eager to share their experiences. J. Drake Hamilton is Fresh Energy's Science Policy Director and has represented Fresh Energy in Minnesota at the climate summits for the last several years. Jay is a leading expert in climate and energy policies at both the state and national levels, and her responsibilities include scientific analysis and policy development of clean energy solutions to global warming that will maximize economic opportunities. From the Paris Climate Summit in 2015 to most recently in Katowice, Poland, Jay engages with advocates, delegates, businesses, and leaders across the world, providing insights into the Midwest's and Minnesota's commitment to climate actions and spurring others to increase their own ambition levels at the UN climate conferences. Patrick Hamilton is the Director of Global Change Initiatives at the Science Museum of Minnesota. Patrick also serves on the Leaders Circle of WeAreStillin, the coalition of American institutions that is dedicated to upholding the Paris Climate Agreement, representing cultural institutions. He develops projects that explore the challenges and opportunities of humanity as now the dominant agent of global change. He is also a board member of District Energy St. Paul, a principal investigator with the University of Minnesota's Urban Heat Island Network, and a fellow of the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. Both Patrick and Jay were very active at COP24 and are excited to share their insight and expertise. We will have about 15 minutes after the presentation for questions, so again, please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them into the box on your left. They are only sent to the moderator, so please feel free to ask away. And with that, I will hand it over to Jay.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am very proud to have represented Fresh Energy, which in Polish is Świeża Energia, represent Fresh Energy in Poland this year. Tell you a little bit, for those who don't know about Fresh Energy, that we were founded nearly 27 years ago. And I'm very proud that almost every year since we were founded, working with our members and partners, we've helped to shape and speed the transition to a clean energy economy here in Minnesota and demonstrate that to the country and the world. Fresh Energy's focus is on market-driven policies. We do in-depth research and analysis. I'm a climate policy expert. We're both climate and energy policy geeks here at Fresh Energy, and I happen to run our Global Warming Solutions program. And I'm going to begin by outlining for you my time in Poland. I was there between December 5th and December 15th. What are the purposes of this year's climate talks? And I'll refer you back to my introductory webinar back on November 30th, which you can find online at fresh-energy.org, which has much more background information in case you weren't able to join us for that webinar. So what we outlined then is what we need to achieve at the Global Climate Summit. That's summarized here on this slide. Very wisely, the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2016 and achieved in 2015 contains the requirement that there need to be rules to operationalize the agreement, and these rules needed to be developed and decided at this year's 2018 Conference of the Parties. So what we found is that climate ministers and negotiators from nations around the world, almost 200 nations, were in Poland working on the common set of rules that will govern the implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement and develop how nations will report out in a transparent way on their own progress and be able to look at other countries' progress going forward. So I'm going to begin by talking to you about the outcomes, and then I'll tell you some stories about how we got there in those 2 weeks. First of all, the Paris Rulebook was in fact adopted, so that was a big success. It took 2 weeks of very tumultuous negotiations. The parties that are referred to in the news are parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was passed in and signed into U.S. law by the Senate in 1992. So the United States is still a party to that underlying treaty. And the signers this year included the 2 largest emitters in the world, China and the United States. So that's very important. The United States signed on to the Paris Rulebook. These are universal, transparent, common rules. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about a rule book, and they're going to govern the efforts to cut emissions and curb global warming worldwide. The deal that was established provides certainty that many people who are needed to develop the projects that are part of global warming solutions need to see. So the deal enables countries, financial organizations, and companies to put into action the principles of the Paris Climate Accord. The commitment is that the Paris Climate Agreement will become operational in 2020. Also, I think it will be very interesting to Americans on this call that the language that was adopted makes it very simple for a new presidential administration to very quickly rejoin the Paris Agreement. So it's a matter of minutes after someone new is elected in 2020 that can happen. The rulebook itself is about 156 pages, and it means that there now is in the world a long-term regulatory framework. And I'm just going to list out the things that countries are going to be able to do to plan together, rules for communication, implementation, reporting out to the rest of the world, and, especially important, following up on their commitments under the Paris Agreement. The parties agreed to revise and enhance their commitments in the form of what their countries will do. That means they agreed to work and develop more ambitious climate actions before 2020, which is critical. The parties also agreed to undertake, and this is a little bit of UN speak here, the parties agreed to undertake a global stock take, as they call it, taking stock of the effectiveness of climate action progress. And there were discussions on robust measures to ensure that countries are held to the standards and can't wiggle out of commitments. And that dominated the final stages of discussions. You may have heard in the media that there was the discussions went a day longer than originally planned, and that delay was caused largely by negotiators from Brazil, who were trying to wiggle out of some of their previous agreements. However, what was accomplished in Poland, the current pledges are not nearly enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius that was agreed to in Paris. The steps forward that were approved in Poland will not be enough to stop climate pollution from reaching critical levels. Instead, countries must still do more, much more, if we are to avoid the worst impacts of global warming. So there's a little bit of disappointment and disillusionment as well, because many folks have been working 3 years into the timeline of the historic Paris Agreement, and climate advocates are finding that they still have to push very hard for progress. However, I would note that it's not a case of we deciding to stop negotiating with the rest of the world. There is no known alternative to talking in person and sharing, in some cases shaming actors that aren't working hard enough, but in many, many cases inspiring best actions that yield results. And those things really happen in human communities best face-to-face. I want to give you a little backdrop, because about a month before these negotiations started, hundreds of climate scientists working together under what's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, responded to a call 2 years ago from the UN asking them to report out to the world what the world will look like with 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming and what we should do to limit those types of impacts, the worst impacts. And on the 8th of October, those climate scientists, after working, I think they worked about round the clock for about a week, because they had to agree on every sentence in their report that came out, and they documented that we have a global emergency on our hands, that climate change demands profound action and rapid action by all nations. But it was important at this conference, and it was very upsetting to a number of people there, including Fresh Energy, that the chair of the IPCC was not even invited to the plenary discussion with the negotiators to present his findings. And that is actually quite an international affront. The IPCC documents, and this is their language, that coal needs to be exited from the power sector. In other words, we need to eliminate coal from power worldwide to the tune of about a 90% reduction by the 2040s, and to take coal out of the power sector entirely by the 2050s. At the conference, I went to an update by an organization that does great work looking at how the world is doing. They're called Climate Analytics. They pointed out that nations' existing commitments put us on a track of 3 degrees Celsius warming, so that's about twice where we need to be. But the good news is that coal plant retirement rates have doubled in the first half of 2018. But the gap between where we are and where we need to be, according to the scientists, remains huge. All countries need to greatly increase their ambitions. But interestingly, with the price of renewable energy way down in many parts of the world, including Minnesota and the United States, renewable energy is now cheaper than existing coal. Everyone has the means to take action, everywhere. Every country needs to do more, and they can. Unfortunately, at the Polish negotiation, a coalition of IPCC blockers, people who would block science-based action, consisting of 4 nations, objected to adopting the IPCC's scientific findings. Those 4 blocking nations, including our own, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Russia. And they proved to be one of the biggest obstacles to early negotiations and to otherwise universal message of the conference of the need to keep warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. The final text, therefore, represents this blocking coalition because there's no endorsement of the IPCC report. However, if you can get yourself past that and to the fact that there was broad agreement and a real rule book for Paris, you can get past that hang-up. But about midway through the conference, there was an uproar from vulnerable nations, low-lying island nations that are now being impacted, and from environmental groups, because of course we should, and Fresh Energy agrees as a science-based organization, of course we should endorse scientific findings. And now I'm going to turn to what, for most people in a story, is they're really fascinated by villains. And I'm going to talk first about who some of the bad actors were. So pictured here is part of the United States political delegation, but we're going to get to their roles specifically, the American role specifically, in a few minutes. And apart from the aforementioned IPCC blockers, those 4 countries, all of whom are big oil producers, I want to focus in on some of the other nations that did their best to stop things from moving forward, at least for part of the time. A big barrier, as I mentioned, was Brazil, whose actions made the talks go into overtime on a weekend. Brazil apparently wanted to double count previous committed actions, and they questioned carbon sequestration in the Amazon. The newly elected right-wing leader, Bolsonaro, was probably part of this. We think that he had his team, we know that he had his team withdraw Brazil as host of next year's climate talks, which had previously been negotiated. There are broad suspicions that Brazil may announce under Bolsonaro's regime that they will leave the Paris Agreement following President Trump on this, but pointedly they did not do so in Poland. They did not use that opportunity. Another set of bad actors were from the nation, unfortunately, of Australia. And so you may know that they sell coal to Japan, which in turn, Japan is the world's largest importer of coal. Australia also has lots of deals to deliver coal to India and much more on the coal front. It was surprising, really shocking, that in a European discussion of climate change hosted in Europe, the European Union itself was mostly silent and merely a bystander in negotiations at a European climate talk, when clearly many countries in the EU see the significance and the need for urgent action. So their silence was stunning and appalling. Countries like Germany, Egypt, China, Korea, and others on various days or sometimes entire weeks of the negotiations did their best to slow things down. By contrast, Poland, the host country, didn't block anything, so they wanted to move forward. Some general frustrations I heard were that some nations were using these talks to try to renegotiate the Paris Agreement. Fortunately, they were unsuccessful in that. There was much talk of essentially a shrinking place for civil society organizations like Fresh Energy in the future COPs, and we think this is very dangerous talk. Many of the people among the 30,000 or so who are in Poland are members of what is known as civil society, and those voices need to be heard. There were attempts to limit how observers can participate in and examine the progress and countries' progress on climate actions. And it was very interesting that the nation of China heavily defended the role of observers going forward. So that was news to a lot of people, and I wanted to make sure that you knew that. Now, as for the U.S. role, I have up here an image of the one and only public U.S. delegation event that was held during those 2 weeks. It was a 75-minute event, and I'm leaving that on the screen deliberately for a long time so you can see the very male presence. And I'll tell you later about how at least one of those people on the U.S. panel is actually a national from Australia. So apparently they couldn't even find 5 people from the United States to sit on a U.S. panel. But before I go into this particular event, this event was not part of the formal negotiations. It was held outside of the negotiation space for the public. And it's emblematic of the fact that there was no U.S. Secretary of State at the negotiations, that this was kind of just about the highest level of the small p political presence of the United States. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the State Department had sent no less than 36 people, career diplomats, who've been in many such negotiations, know the other negotiators from other countries, and have been working with them in some cases since 1992. So they are trusted professionals who were working behind the scenes for the full 2 weeks. They are not political appointees, and they also worked very hard at a number of pre-meetings over the past year to get us to this point. So the gentleman you're seeing to the left there, his name is Wells Griffith. He works for the National Security Agency as well as a number of other positions, formal and informal, within the U.S. government. And they had just begun their discussion when they were interrupted, and I think my next slide will show you this, by members of civil society. So I'm showing you just a few of the hundreds of people who disrupted this event for a full 15 minutes. And you'll see that these were mostly people of color. They were not just from the United States. You're seeing people here from Africa and from India as well as from the United States. And their message was very loudly, shame on you, U.S., for not adopting the scientist language and working harder. And in many cases, it was keep it in the ground. And each of them stood up for just a few seconds or a minute or two to talk about campaigns they are working in their own part of the world and why the U.S. is impeding their work. They were calling out, I'm going to switch back to the middle guy in this image is the representative from Australia. And remember again that a lot of the world buys their coal from Australia. Or think of it this way, Australia is trying to sell more coal to many more parts of the world and use more coal. His name is Patrick Suckling. After about 15 minutes, the protesters left the room. And then what happened was sometimes misreported. The panel, the U.S. panel went on, and they were not speaking to an empty room. People had been waiting to get in the room from all sectors of society and other countries, filled the room about 3/4 full. So the U.S. proceeded. They were interrupted for about 15 minutes of a 75-minute proceeding. And the U.S. position was that, I'll quote Wells Griffith here, in the United States, the policy is not to keep it in the ground, but to use it. So they were talking about both nuclear energy, coal, and natural gas. They represented a focus on what they called a balanced and rational approach, and said that fossil fuel development remains critical to U.S. energy security. All in all, the U.S. role at the whole negotiations was rather, to quite a bit, schizophrenic. They were, on the same hand, pushing coal and dissing climate science, but on the other hand, working hard in negotiating rooms, especially for strong transparency rules. when it came to closing potential loopholes that could allow countries to dodge their commitments to cut emissions, the U.S. pushed harder than nearly anyone else on transparency rules that were adopted that put all countries under the same system. So I believe that the U.S. negotiators actually played a central role in the talks and in a helpful way, helping to broker an outcome that is true to the Paris vision of a common transparency framing, so everyone can know how to figure out what other countries are doing and why. I want to tell you a little bit about Fresh Energy's role here. These were the fourth negotiations of which Fresh Energy was an observer. And we are there to show that in the heartland of the United States, there is grave concern about this climate problem, this climate disaster, but there's also a lot of action that goes far beyond what can happen in the coasts of the United States. People around the world, as you know, are very well educated. They understand that the heartland of the U.S. is the place where many environmental policies, like climate policies, sometimes begin before they're adopted nationally. And we were there to talk about U.S. states, including Minnesota, who are charging ahead and making climate progress. We know that actions that Minnesota, other states, cities, and companies have already committed to in the United States can achieve 2/3 or more of the U.S. commitment under the Paris Agreement. So we know a lot is possible, especially given that no policy progress has happened under the current U.S. federal administration, which instead is busy dismantling climate policies. It's important to know that policies that are already in place are working in the United States, and it's important for us to let other countries know that. Too often, the only thing other countries hear is what the Trump administration has been saying, and they're not hearing about this important climate progress. So I refer you to a set of documents called Fulfilling America's Pledge, so you can look at what's happening. Fresh Energy also spoke about Xcel Energy's role, as we did in the Bonn climate negotiations very publicly last year, and we updated that information because the first week of the conference, Xcel Energy, not just in Minnesota, but in all 8 states it sells electricity in, has now committed to 100% zero carbon energy by 2050, with a down payment on that of 85% carbon-free by 2030, the first utility in the entire United States to do that. So we had extraordinary opportunities, Fresh Energy did, to meet with parties from Canada, Indonesia, the United States, and Fiji. Here, Patrick Hamilton, who you're about to hear from, is pictured with Frank Bainimarama. Some of you will recognize him. He is the Prime Minister of the island of Fiji, and he's the outgoing president of the COP. He led the COP in Bonn, Germany last year. So we got to spend 3 hours with these people who are in the negotiating rooms and ask them a bunch of questions and get responses from them. Again, from the U.S. negotiators, Indonesia, Fiji, and Canada. So we're happy to talk with people offline in more detail about that as well, but I thought that was quite extraordinary. And we were able to use our connections to draw some impressive media coverage, including from the Associated Press, and Patrick will talk about that in a minute, on December 7th and 8th across the United States on TV and in newspapers. And we were able to secure a live interview that was recorded on December 11th and broadcast here in Minnesota on Minnesota Public Radio on December 12th, 10 minutes talking about what Minnesota has at stake from the global climate negotiations. So I'm now going to turn it over to our second speaker, Patrick Hamilton.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you all for taking the time to listen in on this webinar. So I'm the Director of Global Change Initiatives at the Science Museum of Minnesota, or as the Poles would say, Muzaki Naki Minnesota. And as part of my work, I develop new projects on a wide variety of environmental issues for the museum, but especially over the last 5 years on energy, water, and climate change. And in particular, I've been working on climate change for over 20 years. In fact, one of the first things that I worked on was bringing in a photographic exhibition by National Geographic photographer Gary Brosh back in 2001, when he had been spending extensive amounts of time in the Arctic regions of North America and around Asia, and was already documenting back at the turn of the century remarkable changes in the climate of the Arctic due to climate change and global warming. I also worked very closely with colleagues at the Science Museum to develop a statement on human-caused climate change, which is now, it has been on the Science Museum's website since 2007. My work involves a lot of collaboration both internally at the Science Museum, but externally, I think epitomized by a conference that the Science Museum hosted in collaboration with Fresh Energy and Health Partners for a Healthy Climate last April, called Code Blue for Planet Earth, where we had 200 doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals come to the Science Museum to discuss climate change and its implications for human health. Also, helped to get the Science Museum to subscribe to Community Solar Garden, which now offsets 34% of the Science Museum's annual electrical consumption. So I think a big opportunity for the Science Museum is to emphasize the science of climate change and also the opportunities for climate action. That is why last spring, when WeAreStillin announced its expansion of its categories to include cultural institutions, I encouraged the Science Museum to become an inaugural member of WeAreStillin. And so I went to the COP24 conference as a credentialed observer on behalf of Fresh Energy, but I was there in particular to represent WeAreStillin in its role in helping to elevate climate action, both here in the United States and around the world. And in particular, WeAreStillin had a presence at what was called the U.S. Climate Action Center. This is the second year in a row for the U.S. Climate Action Center at the COP conferences, because it's the second year in a row in which the United States has not had a formal presence in the pavilion of the COP conferences. So as a result, corporations, foundations, and others have funded this presence at the United States to emphasize the subnational actions that are taking place. And for those of you who don't know the history of WeAreStillin, I'll give you a very brief story. It started in June of 2017, in early June, when President Trump stepped out into the Rose Garden and announced his intention to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. And the very next day, a coalition of both politicians but also foundations and businesses and corporations announced the establishment of WeAreStillin, which is now a coalition of over 3,600 businesses and organizations spanning all 50 states, representing over 150 million Americans and nearly $9.5 trillion of gross domestic product. It encompasses businesses, states, cities, universities, tribes, healthcare organizations, faith groups, and as I said, now cultural organizations, particularly science museums and science centers. And so as part of the U.S. Climate Action Center at the COP24 conference, WeAreStillin was given the opportunity to use that space for 4 days to emphasize both back to the United States and to an international audience the fact that there are very large and significant segments of the population in the United States that are still committed to the Paris Agreement and climate action. So I had the opportunity to participate in a kickoff session on the Friday morning of the WeAreStillin presence at the U.S. Climate Action Center. And this panel was assembled to help convey the breadth of WeAreStillin. So it had religious representation, corporate, and the cultural institutions categories of WeAreStillin. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was pleased to learn afterwards that there was an Associated Press, an AP reporter in the audience who snapped this image and filed a story which appeared in numerous newspapers around the United States, and then was also then picked up by ABC News for further distribution. So one of the big goals of WeAreStillin at the COP24 was to have a big visibility, both internationally and nationally, and fortunately that also helped to transpire. But one of the important goals of WeAreStillin was to convey the fact that although President Trump has announced that he is withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement, that there is still an enormous groundswell of support for the Paris Agreement in the United States and a lot of very innovative and large-scale climate mitigation efforts underway. And through the great efforts of the organizers of the WeAreStillin presence at the COP24 conference, several bilateral meetings were set up between myself and other WeAreStillin representatives and members of the negotiating teams for Germany, the Alliance of Small Island States, and France. And we met with those negotiators primarily to help them understand the existence of WeAreStillin and to help them appreciate that no matter what they may have heard, there is still enormous support in the United States for climate action. And to a person, they expressed a great interest in that information and that it was new information for them, that they were heartened to know that there was considerable action still taking place in the United States on climate change. And they promised that they would be taking this information back to their negotiating teams and back to their countries when they returned home from the COP24. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Jay to fill you in a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Pat. And now that brings me to just a quick summary of what we've covered so far, and then we'll open it up to your questions. It's this cross-sector work that Patrick was describing that happened at the Climate Action Center that got the most attention from countries around the globe. They were surprised to learn how much is happening at the state and regional level in the United States. They like the fact that decarbonization of the electric sector is already underway and proving to be the cheapest thing that states can do. Remember, when they hear about what's happening in the United States, the press coverage is overwhelmingly about what our president has tweeted and doesn't nearly go into depth about what is happening across sectors in the United States. So I just wanted to, just as before I go on, just mention that one of the reasons that Patrick got invited to serve on this WeAreStillin panel is the extraordinary work that the Science Museum has done on energy retrofits. And I just wanted to use this opportunity to ask Patrick a couple of questions to elaborate on that. So Patrick, given that one set of solutions to climate change is simply to build all new net zero energy houses and buildings, why was an energy retrofit the first set of large components of how the Science Museum decided to act?
That's a good question, because when we think about buildings, all buildings are responsible for 40% of energy consumption in the United States. And large buildings, like the Science Museum of Minnesota, have a disproportionate impact on climate change because we use a disproportionate amount of energy. The Science Museum uses as much electricity annually as hundreds of households, which is why about 4 years ago, in collaboration with Xcel Energy, District Energy St. Paul, Trane, Ingersoll Rand, and Target, and Ecolab, and Wells Fargo, we underwent an extensive retrofit that took advantage of the fact that large buildings produce enormous amounts of waste heat that has to be managed. And typically that waste heat is just thrown away, but we are now reusing and recycling that heat energy and therefore cutting our hot water heating bills by 65%, saving hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. And so far to date, we've cut our carbon emissions by a third. So buildings have a very important role to play, and energy efficiency of buildings is extremely important because we have such a huge stock of existing buildings.
So we're not going to build our way out of this problem. We're going to need to take care of our existing homes and commercial buildings, and we're going to need to retrofit them on a large scale.
We won't build our way out, we'll retrofit our way out.
Thank you. That's an important thing to know. I would also caution people, which I learned during the first week of the conference, to watch out for rhetoric versus action on climate change. And I'll give you a specific example. During the first week of the negotiations, the Polish president of the whole COP invited representatives, leaders from 2 countries, Norway and Costa Rica, to specifically work on raising climate ambitions of all nations. And to a lot of us, that sounded like actually working on a higher ambition. In fact, a number of countries actually formed a higher ambition coalition. But when you dug down And people I knew from Norway and Costa Rica who were in civil society, so not officially part of the negotiations, they went and asked their leaders exactly what is it that you were supposed to be negotiating. They weren't actually negotiating. They were just having a conversation about higher ambition. So it's important to know that if you're not actually ratcheting up your climate ambitions and getting deeper reductions, you're really just having a conversation. You're just making conversation. For example, the European Union did speak out about ambition solidarity, which again sounds like a big deal. But when you see that was followed up by a very quiet negotiating presence, that some people who were in those meetings referred to the EU as quote unquote mere spectators, you know that they're not working actually very hard on raising ambition. And I would also conclude by saying, again, that there's really no alternative to these time-consuming and sometimes painstaking international negotiations. After all, if countries want to tackle global problems, not just climate, but other global problems, especially at a time when multilateral diplomacy is under pressure from growing nationalism in countries including Poland, that we need to look each other in the eye, we need to learn from each other, we need to spend a fair amount of time learning what's actually going on in other countries, what is successful, so that we can take that success and model future projects in other countries on that. And we can actually get people into relationships with each other so that they can ask questions and get those projects developed and on the ground. We also learned, and this is a big takeaway, that states can lead the way on climate change. When the federal government refuses to act, as ours has unfortunately, state governments will act. And I'm going to quote the governor-elect of Minnesota, Tim Walz, who said on the day he was elected and then days before, he referred to climate change as an existential threat, not just to Minnesota, but to the globe. And he said very clearly, if Washington won't lead on it, Minnesota will, because Minnesota's future, he said, after all, is in the green economy. A very large question for all of us going forward, given the changing economics, given the fact that we now have a rule book in place, is how do we all work to manage this transition from coal and the other fossil fuels that are causing the problem to cheaper energy? It's not as if it won't happen eventually, but that's not good enough, the scientists say. The question for all of us is, how do we make that transition away from fossil fuels faster? And how do we make sure that no one is left behind? And how do we take this intriguing question that we're spending a lot of time on in Fresh Energy, as others are as well, about, well, as the electric power system gets cleaner and cleaner and closer to zero carbon, how do we push more of our energy needs away from oil and away from natural gas to rely on zero carbon electricity? We call it beneficial electrification. And finally, there's homework going forward. There's a lot that didn't happen. In Poland. The current UN Secretary General is named Antonio Guterres, and you may know that he's hosting a summit in September in New York City, part of the UN General Assembly meeting. His emphasis will be on the broad suite of sustainable development goals that nations, unlike the United States, but most other nations in the world, are working hard on. It's important to know that the UN Secretary General, one of his top priorities is climate change. We very much support at Fresh Energy that September summit, but want to alert you that it is only going to be meaningful if it actually produces a move forward on national commitments to carbon reduction. So maybe this is sounding familiar to you now. It's not just more rhetoric we need. It's not just cool talking points for the media, but actually who is taking action and doing the heavy lift to increase all countries' actual commitments and actions. Another part of the homework going forward is very important to people I met who are from small island developing states. And this is in response to one of the questions we're getting in the chat box. How do they feel about the outcomes? They're really concerned about what they feel on a daily basis, which is known in UN parlance as loss and damage. Think of that as the countries whose economies are vulnerable right now to the impacts of climate change, like small island nations, whose high point may be a meter above sea level. So those are countries that right now have that existential threat. And how is it that the world is going to make sure that they can continue to thrive? And how do we compensate places and people like that who are seeing losses and damage that have already been incurred and that are irreversible. And we did not see successful action on that in Poland. So that's something that needs to be addressed going forward. We're about to get to the Q&A. We have a number of them that Patrick and I will both take. But I wanted to take this opportunity to let you know that if you like this fresh energy approach, where we work across sectors, where we work with a complement of businesses large and small across Minnesota, we work with cultural institutions like the Science Museum, we work with health professionals who care very deeply about climate change and are on the front lines of dealing with climate impacts. If you like our cross-sectoral positive approach, please consider at the end of the year becoming a member of Fresh Energy. And if you go online right after this call, you can just go to fresh-energy.org and it'll be an easy button for you to click to donate. I want to welcome the many members and donors who are on this call right now, and now we're going to take some of your questions. But first, I think we might need a few words from Anna to remind you about how to ask a question if you haven't yet. Anna, please.
Thank you, Jay and Patrick, so much for sharing your insight about this global event. So we've got some time for questions. Again, to ask a question, you can type it into the chat, which is on the left side of your monitor. The questions are anonymous, so feel free to go for it.
Thanks, Anna. And we have a couple of questions about why hold a conference about climate change, climate action in a coal mining region of Poland? And what are the pluses and minuses to that, and how do we think it shook out? And I'll just say that I think it's really important to hold meetings like this in a place that is very dependent on coal. So just to give you some of the stats, about 80% or more of Poland's electricity comes from burning coal. The region that we were in for 2 weeks hosts about 90,000 coal mining jobs. So it's a very important part of the economy. But this is the type of transition we need to talk about, and we need to be very specific about how it will benefit everyone going forward and make sure that that happens. And I overheard Patrick when he was responding to a question from a gentleman from Poland when he was speaking on that panel. He illustrated for you. And that person was just a little bit wringing his hands because of this extreme dependence on coal in Poland. And was, I think, a little bit losing hope. And I thought Patrick had a great response. And I wonder if you would just reiterate that for folks, Pat.
Sure. I told him that 14 years ago, the state of Minnesota was 75% dependent on coal for electrical generation. And as of just a couple of years ago, that was down to 39%, and that we were continuing a rapid decarbonization of the electrical sector. So we were where Poland is now 14 years ago, but we have made a very marked transition, and we are anticipating that continuing forward. So there is a path forward for coal-dependent countries.
So in other words, what Minnesota has done in just half a human generation should give places like Poland hope going forward, because especially since we've done that in a way that also has grown our economy in those 14 years about 29%. So there's really has been no trade-off between economic vitality and big reductions in greenhouse gas emissions going forward. I think I'll turn now to a question about, this is a question which kind of hits at the heart of the crux of the matter. So I've been referring to this, the fact that the U.S. was actually negotiating at a time when our federal administration has announced that they intend, as soon as they can, they're not able to do that yet, but as soon as they can, to drop out of the Paris Agreement. So that seems to be a disconnect. So why should the U.S. be allowed to even spend time negotiating when they intend to drop out of the Paris Agreement? And my response to that is partly to draw your attention to what came out of the text on December 15th, which is it is very easy for countries who leave the agreement to, within a matter of hours or days, get back in the agreement when federal administrations change. And that could be important not only for the U.S., but also for other countries, should their newly elected, more right-wing centered regimes decide or threaten to drop out of this global agreement. It's really important, too, to have the United States, which is a strong supporter of the underlying treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that underlying 1992 treaty that was strongly supported by the U.S. Senate, to continue having these negotiations. Those civil servants I refer to, roughly 36 of whom were working day and night at these negotiations, they have long-term relationships with their counterparts in other nations. And it's really important to keep the conversation going and to keep the flow of information going. Because too often, as many of you have probably seen in your own daily business talking about climate change, climate solutions get completely left out of the conversation. And people who have seen me speak know that I have relatively little patience for hand-wringing about just talking about the impacts of climate change. Clearly, I think those are really important. But unless you're spending more than half of your time talking about what the actual solutions are, I think you're not being that as helpful as you could be in moving the dialogue forward. And we need that not only at the Minnesota level, but at the international level going forward. And I think please add to that.
I think what the United States can continue to contribute is that we are seeing significant decline in burning of coal, not just in Minnesota, but in other states around the country. So we continue to demonstrate the possibility of rapid decarbonization of the electrical sector.
Yeah. And I would add something that I came across from another organization I won't name in a different part of the country that was talking about the Xcel Energy's CEO of operations in 8 states that sell electricity, their commitment to get to 100% carbon-free electricity. There was a news outlet in another part of the country that covered the story and got it wrong. They said Xcel Energy operates in Michigan and New Mexico. And it's like, those are like the smallest states where Xcel operates. They operate predominantly in Minnesota and in Colorado, but in 8 states between the Canadian border and the Mexican border. So it's really important to get this right. It was interesting to talk to other people from delegations in other parts of the world. They did not know that that had happened. And I think, Patrick, you said when you were meeting with the German delegation that they specifically asked you how Xcel intended to do that. Is that right?
They did. They were very impressed by that, as were all the bilateral groups that we met with. But the Germans in particular asked how Xcel Energy was going to replace the electricity generated with burning coal, and I said with wind and solar, and the Germans nodded very appreciatively with that information, and they found it very exciting.
You know, what I found in the negotiations, as I have time and time again, is Minnesotans can hold our heads high when it comes to actions we've already taken. I know there's a tendency to elevate certain nations and say that they're doing it all right. Nobody is doing it all right yet, but I know Germany a number of years ago, when they announced that they were trying to get off both nuclear energy and coal energy at the same time, have run into roadblocks, as you might expect. That's a really big shift, and they still burn a lot of coal. They just tend to call it lignite, which rather than coal when you look at official charts of what they're burning. But lignite, as many of us who know this issue well, is the dirtiest form of coal. And so we need to know that when some of our utilities and big corporations take actions and move toward 100% clean energy, this can have a very major positive impact for all of the rest of us, because it makes it even cheaper for the rest of us to get off coal and to go on to renewable energy going forward.
In the bilateral meetings, one of the key points that we emphasized is that, of course, countries should continue to engage our federal government in discussions about climate change. But in addition to doing that, they should also reach out to states, to cities, because a lot of interesting innovation is happening at a subnational level, and they can help to foster and continue that acceleration at different levels within the United States, and continue the discussions and the innovations that we're all looking for.
Here's a great question that I haven't heard before that came up in the chat box. Do all countries know how to reduce carbon on a national level, or do they need technical help? And I'll first give you my perspective on that. One of the reasons why we need to get past the issue of whether we're going to have a rule book for Paris, the Paris Accord or not, now that we do have that, is that we need to be able to assemble all nations to have really deep conversations every year, every month in between those big negotiations, so that as different parts of the world discover new solutions that are really cost effective and overcome barriers to adopting them, they can share those means of moving forward with other nations, so that not everyone needs to recreate the wheel. The scientists are really clear that we don't have time for that. And as a human being, I've noticed the way to avoid going out on your own and making the same mistakes that others have is to actually keep talking to people and getting in a trusting relationship with them, so you know that you're in a space where you can share what didn't work, share the real barriers that you face that other countries will surely face, and how you overcame those barriers. So that becomes a much more productive set of conversations going forward. I'm going to turn this next question over to Patrick, because I know he's done a lot of thinking about this. And we always get this question when we go out and speak. Should individuals walk the talk? What is the role of individual action on a big thorny problem like climate change with respect to all types of other actions that can be taken?
Well, I think that what's important for individuals to think about is how their efforts can link up with their communities, with their cities, with their states. And I think that oftentimes when we're faced with this enormous issue, we can look very small and try to think about, well, just what was my piece of this? But I think a big opportunity is to imagine how our actions fit into a larger framework. For example, as electricity gets cleaner and greener, the zero carbon source of energy in Minnesota, we're looking at transitioning to electricity for mass transit, but then there's be opportunities for people in their individual homes to think about how to use electricity that in the past we've used natural gas to do the work of. For example, heating hot water or using heat pumps to heat our homes instead of boilers and furnaces. So I think about how we can use innovations that help catalyze the other innovations that we want to see going forward.
Yeah, I would also encourage people to think about, for these very large questions, very different from climate change, but think about the right to love and marry whoever you want. We now have that across the United States. But we didn't settle for, okay, you on your own couple, you decide who you're going to love and who you're going to marry. Instead, what we said is, we need national policy to make sure that this happens. So that's simply the way I think, especially in democratic societies, where we use government to determine the rules, just like the rules of a Paris rule book, how we're going to live together. What are the standards we're going to agree to and set for each other? And when you're talking about a very big problem, it's important to think, how does that individual reaction, how does that mirror up to the level where things are possible for everyone? And things are a little bit easier for everyone going forward. There are a number of questions I'm seeing that I can't answer, and that is because I just want to make it clear for people that there are two types of parties to this negotiation. There are the people who are negotiating officially on behalf of their governments. So sometimes they do things in plenary sessions that are open for everyone to listen to. Many of the negotiations are happening in private conversations before they come out with documents that they want the rest of the world to take a look at before they finalize them. But a great number of parties who are at these negotiations are in the place of like Fresh Energy, where we are not party to some of those, we're not a real party to the negotiations. So we have to form relationships with people who are, as you've seen, Fresh Energy did that, and so we get information that way, but it means that we don't know everything that was discussed. But I will follow up if you, with people who've left questions like that. If I know partial answers, I'll let you know what I know about those things going forward. I'm looking around at the list of questions, and let's see. Somebody asked, do the official delegations directly respond to people like protesters who were, rightly so, in abundance in the hallways outside the negotiations when protesters cause a big stir and get a lot of attention? Or do the negotiations take place in a separate space? As I said, there really is a separate space for that. But I would keep in mind that the negotiators are people too. They leave the negotiations, they come out for coffee, they come out for lunch, and they especially hear from the media in their countries. So the media all over the world are taking note of those protests and amplifying that. So the negotiators cannot escape that. So it's a very important part of, sometimes it's called holding negotiators to account for what they're doing. And that's why I've specified, too, that you should be skeptical about rhetoric, and you should pay attention to what's actually on paper and to whether carbon reductions are actually happening and being documented going forward. I'm going to have Anna help us in closing out the last stages of this as we're getting to the top of the hour.
Great. Thank you, Jay and Patrick, for all of your insight, and thank you to everyone who joined us today to learn more about this huge moment in human history. I just wanted to take a moment and remind you that Fresh Energy is co-hosting an event with Global Minnesota on Wednesday, January 30th. It's a free event, and as Jay and Patrick both mentioned, as we tackle this problem, it's really important to gather in person to discuss solutions together, to try to think about how we can tackle this very thorny problem. So please feel free to look out for more information about that, and check out online for more information, freshenergy.org. We will be sending out a link to the recording. If you have any other questions that we were unable to answer, you can contact Jay at the information provided before, or email me, Anna, at johnson@fresh-energy.org. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.